All right, if you're out there, take a look at our slide. Holidays, excuse me, just around the corner. How about in the chat, share your favorite holiday tradition or a holiday song? In sync.
I love all Christmas music, but that is my favorite.
Love it.
The Hallmark
holiday album is my favorite.
Oh, yes, cut out Christmas cookies. I like that, Candace. Get started in a couple minutes, but if you just joined us, we're throwing in the chat either a favorite holiday tradition, a holiday song, both. Why not? And you know, we'd love to see your pretty faces if you can. I know it's a little awkward, but we'll all be awkward together. All right, my computer clock just turned 3:30, but we'll give everybody just the rest of this minute to join. Drop in your favorite holiday tradition or song in the chat if you want to. And a reminder that if you're more than one person kind of behind that Zoom screen, if you can, throw both your names in your little Zoom screen name. If you're not sure how to do that, if you hover over your Zoom box, there's 3 little dots kind of in the right corner. You click on that, and one of the options is to rename yourself. All right, Lindsay, we ready to kick this thing off? Let's do it. Well, we are excited to see you, everyone. Welcome back. This is our second of 3 sessions that kind of comprise the launch of our Strong Start Network. Real quickly, we'll go through a few quick reminders and then jump straight into some network learning with our partners from TNTP. And then before you know it, our 2 hours will be up and we'll be talking about next steps and a look at our schedule for the spring, at least some tentative dates that we want to go ahead and get on your calendar. All right, so first, just names and faces. We're not going to go through these again like we did last week, but just wanted to include them in the presentation slides. So as you go back and you want to remind yourself kind of who's who on our side, you can do so, but feel free to reach out to me. I am Bethany Fillers, the Director of Professional Learning. Sometimes you receive emails from me. Most often, though, you receive them from Brittany Siebert. So those 2 names are probably most familiar to you, but we'll all get to know each other a little bit better in the coming months together. All right, also we have our real life coaches. You saw them last week and got to know them in your breakout rooms. And we'll continue to use some strategies like that to make space for collaboration, as well as some other fun things that Lindsay has waiting for us. So thank you to our coaches for helping us facilitate. All right, this week, I wanted to show a little bit more about who makes up our network. So last week, it was a big kind of broad overview of the counties who submitted applications or who were represented by their applications. But this week, I wanted to shout out more specifically the way you submitted your applications in terms of what makes up your Strong Start team. So we have Carter County with a district team, Cott County and Greene County, both with district teams, some comprised of district leaders, school leaders, and then teachers from various schools. Lincoln Heights Middle School submitted a school-based team, so that was exciting. Also, Hamlin County had a couple other schools that came together to make a team. And then Clinch School and Churchill Middle School are representing as school-based teams. And then last but not least, Jefferson County with some district leadership, school leadership, and teachers representing 3 of their schools. So again, each time we get together, we'll get to know each other a little bit more, but wanted to give a shout out to the members today. All right, next, quick reminder about the website. Brittany has tagged this in several of her communications, but just wanted to remind folks to get familiar with our Strong Start Network website. It serves as really the hub for all things Strong Start, including where we'll post announcements there on the homepage, all meeting information, and that's via that shared calendar, and that includes your Zoom links and dates and times, session materials, member information. So right now it includes just your names, but we'll be adding to that over the next several weeks. Then also, as we jump into learning cycles together, we'll share on our website network learning and celebrations, and then who knows what else we might throw on there. Now with these little screenshots that I included, there you go. Just a reminder that on that navigation bar, we have the home page. On the About Us little tab, you see that little down arrow. That just means there's some subpages. So if you hover over that or click, you'll see that that includes a subpage for network members where you'll find your names and ways to contact us. You'll note to the right of that is the calendar that I was just speaking to. And then last but not least, the resources, which includes just the basic resource page, which will keep just general stuff that we'll use as a network over time. But then if you use that little drop down arrow, you'll start to see subpages related to different events that we'll do as a network. So the Strong Start series is on there from this fall. There's a subpage dedicated just for this launch where you'll find all the resources for these 3 sessions. And then over the spring semester, that you'll see that drop down grow. For each of our sessions, we'll add a separate subpage. That way you're not having to scroll through any and everything we've ever done. You can jump just to specific dates. If you have any questions about the website, please don't hesitate to reach out. And maybe somebody from the Rural Life team, if you'll drop in the website link to the chat, that'll make it easy for folks to find it too. All right, before I hand it over to Lindsay, just wanted to remind us, what was our original goal in designing the Strong Start Network? I mentioned this last week, but as we kind of move forward as a network, we'll shift from what our original kind of design goal was to what our actual aim will be for the work of the network. So in designing this network, we wanted to make sure that we offered ELA curricular support. We knew that would be huge this year as our ELA teachers were going to be jumping into implementing new resources. And that was before we had even thought about COVID-19 or knew anything about it. So we know that it's even more important now to kind of pull together as a learning community and think about how best to use those resources and really establish that learning community. And that's where you come in, right, as lead learners across Northeast Tennessee, really championing this challenging and rewarding work around middle school literacy. So then on our next slide, I want us to just start thinking about what is our network's North Star, right? What are we really aiming for as something we want to accomplish as a network? So very generally speaking, of course, it's improve student outcomes in the middle school literacy classroom. But really over the course of the next semester and on into the next year and some, over the course of our network, we're going to get really specific and we're going to start to define how we're going to know that we're seeing improvement. And I want us to all just start maybe even thinking about that ourselves, like on a day-to-day basis in your classroom or as leaders. What are ways that you know that you're seeing improvement? Because in the end, you can't improve what you can't measure. And so that'll become really key to the work that we do as a network. All right, at this time, I'll hand it over to Lindsay as we kick off part 2 of our launch.
Thanks, Bethany. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm excited to see you all. I'm seeing lots of little boxes in front of me, seeing you all today for our second session before we take a little break, and hopefully everyone gets to rejuvenate and relax, and then we'll come back strong in January. So just a reminder what our year will look like together, our work together over the course of the year. We're going to continue to build a shared vision of excellent instruction, excellent literacy instruction together. We're going to spend time diving deep into the curricular materials that you all are using, and then we're going to engage in ongoing professional learning cycles. Just a reminder of where we are in terms of kicking off our work in terms of the launch that Bethany talked about. We had our first session last week where we talked about the findings from the report, The Opportunity Myth. Today, we're going to talk about some of the science of reading, which you guys previewed in your pre-work, and the literacy shifts. And then in January, we're going to kick off our first learning cycle together. So today, our session will be focusing on a new literacy experience. We're going to be using the science of reading and the literacy shifts to create a change in the student literacy experience. And through our time together today, our goals are that we will all understand the research behind the science of reading. We'll be able to identify and understand the literacy shifts and understand how this research and the shifts will impact how we instruct students in our classrooms, in our schools. Okay, so to kick off our work today, we're going to talk a little bit about a problem that we know is pretty rampant, not only in Tennessee, but nationally. So in Tennessee and across the nation, even students who are proficient in 3rd grade lose ground as they encounter more complex texts in subsequent grades. Like I said, this is a national problem, not just a local problem to us here in Tennessee. So what we're saying is that students who were doing well in 3rd grade, that by the time they got to 5th grade, one of the students who was proficient had fallen to basic, and 3 of the students who were advanced had fallen to proficient. So this regression over time is likely because we aren't attending to build students' knowledge and vocabulary over the grades. Students don't have the support and foundation of being able to really comprehend these complex texts that are required in later grades. So I'm sure what we see is a lot of our students are able to read the text, but they don't really understand what they're reading. So what can we do to change this? One thing I thought about was using a high quality tier 1 curriculum like you all are using, build student knowledge, content knowledge, and then also teach foundational skills. What else could we be doing? You can drop in the chat some other ideas you may have about what we can do to make sure that this slide doesn't continue to happen. Using those high quality curriculums, building content knowledge, teaching foundational skills, what other ideas might you have that you can drop into the chat for me? Have high expectations, 100%. Complex questioning, yes, love it. Yep, continuing those high expectations regardless. Encourage critical thinking and authentic application, equitable learning experiences. Continue to drive learning and engagement. Read more to our students until 8th grade, according to the reading. Grade level expectations. Yes, all of these things are so important to make sure that we are continuing to do this to change what we have seen and has become a national problem in terms of our students continuing to slip as they progress into the upper grades. So we're going to start today by thinking about the science of reading. You guys had some time to preview what the science of reading is through your pre-work, so thank you all for taking the time to do that. Today, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into it and then talk about what that means for instruction as it's related to some of the literacy shifts and what we will do in our instructional practices. So a lot of you may be thinking as middle school educators, well, what does this have to do with us, right? So as middle school educators, most of you have students who can probably read, right? But some might not really be it. And what we want to do as middle school educators is we want to make sure we understand the mechanics of how students learn to read, because then it will help us working with middle schoolers to identify where these gaps may be and understand how we could potentially address them in our own classrooms. So it really is relevant to even us as middle school educators. So what is the science, what the science of reading is and is not? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to read this paragraph, and then we'll move on into deeper talking about the science of reading. The science of reading is using evidence to drive how we instruct and students and following the science, not the philosophy. So this may require giving up some deeply held myths that we as educators may know or be privy to. And it also requires us to think about ways we may have contributed to those myths or that philosophy over the course of time, and what we will do to change and focus on the science versus the philosophy. So what does this look like for students in terms of the science of reading? So when we think about the majority of our students, we think about them in different tiers, right? 35 to 40% of kids will learn to read with little instruction and really few repetitions of phonics skills. The majority of our students, though, about that 40 to 50% where you see in orange, those are the kids that need systematic, explicit, sequential instruction and how the code on English works and how to help them build those neural pathways between the visual, the auditory, and the semantic areas of the brain. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the brain in a few more slides. And then there's about those 10 to 15 of students who require systematic sequential instruction in phonics and phonemic awareness, but with lots and lots of repetition. These are students we might consider dyslexic. It's really important, though, to note here that dyslexic doesn't mean that students can't learn to read. It just means that they need more intensive repetition than some of their peers. Then there are some kids, this bottom part where we see who are choice exceptional. They really suffer from dysgraphia, which can complicate things, or severe dyslexia, and they'll need additional support in reading. And that number is really less than 5%. So realistically, 95% of our students should be reading as long as we are providing that strong instruction. So the bottom line here is that it's not about student ability at all. It's a question of the instruction we're providing to students. We need to make sure we're providing systematic, explicit instruction in phonics, phonemic awareness, and word recognition. That is the best approach that supports learning for all students. And this doesn't mean by any stretch, as you all know, that teaching reading is simple, nor is learning to read for a large number of students simple. But it does mean that we can improve student options in life by being the best teachers possible, by giving them those foundational reading instruction. And for those students who may continue to struggle, really intervening in effective ways. And what we do, we have to make sure, excuse me, and we do that based on what works, right? Not what we have always done, because what we've always done based on data that we've seen across the country, it's not working. We need to use the research and research that has data to back it up. We need to use this idea of the science of reading to guide us. So, how do we learn to read? What is reading acquisition? So we're going to dive right in and start to talk about really what's happening, what's going on, and how children learn to acquire the skills needed to become fluent readers. So this is a study from 1986, and it's a theory called the simple view of reading. It tells us basically that the amount of words that one can decode, that's the D, multiplied by the amount of language they understand, which is in blue, equals their reading comprehension. So it's called the simple view of reading. So it must be pretty simple, right? But think about it. If students aren't able to decode, so if that becomes a 0, then the product actually becomes a 0, right? So if students are missing either the decoding piece or the language comprehension piece, they're not able to truly become fluent readers. So think about it this way. Maybe I can decode or sound out Hungarian, but I don't actually understand it. Or I may know a few phrases in Chinese, but I can't read it because I don't know Chinese characters. So without all of those things working together, students cannot become fluent readers that can comprehend what they're reading. The simple view is useful, but it doesn't really help us get granular about what goes in to becoming a fluent reader that can comprehend what they're reading. So we're going to use a more comprehensive model. Some of you may have seen this before. Some of you who joined some sessions earlier in the year, we spent some time talking about Scarborough's reading rope. So Scarborough created this visual in the early 2000s to show how the various skills in literacy develop over time. So first, those skills develop individually, which you see all the way to the left, and then they interact with one another. So based on what you see here, what ideas does this model convey to you guys about the process of becoming a reader? What do you think this means for students as they become readers? You could just take yourself off mute and share out some ideas you may have after looking at this reading rope. What ideas does this model convey about the process of becoming a reader?
Well, I think it looks a little bit more complicated than our last formula because while the simple reading, I think I loved how you used other languages. It really helped me kind of just solidify that. But with your rope, you've got so many different pieces that go together and of course promote each other to go forward. But I was thinking, well, we could have a weak rope. You know what I mean? Well, in the last formula, you either have a reader or a non-reader if your decoding skills are so little.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lindsay. Any other thoughts or ideas about what this tells you about what it takes to become a reader?
The brain taking up more, if they don't have automaticity, then they won't have free brain space to comprehend the language, and it would probably be more converse. Like kids that have that are reading on grade level in that 40 to 50% you showed on your chart probably need a lot of strategic word recognition and practice and sounds as the words and language becomes more complex to continually support that progression of being able to read more complex text and comprehend it.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Sarah. Any other ideas or thoughts?
Lindsay, I'll add that I appreciate the contrast between the braided rope for word recognition and kind of that twisted rope for language comprehension. And that word recognition we know is very kind of systematic, like you were speaking to, and like we read about in our pre-reading. And we kind of think about a braid you do in a very systematic way to get the braided look. Versus language comprehension really develops over time. It spirals. We're kind of using those different things based sometimes on the need of the text or the content area, that kind of thing. So I just like that even the way the picture or even the way the concept is depicted kind of ties to how those individual aspects work.
Great. Thanks, Bethany. Yeah, so as you can see, there are these two main parts, right? There's that word recognition, which we see below in green, and the language comprehension above in that bluish purple. And so these correspond to the key components of this, the simple view. But each of these components consists of several more specific strands or skills that the simple view did not talk about. These skills and strands students need to master to be able to become proficient readers. So when we think about word recognition, we see sounds, letters, words. language comprehension, the knowledge, the vocabulary, sentences, connections, the gist. It is not as simple potentially as the simple view that we just talked about. There are a lot of things that need to come together in order for students to become proficient readers. So what happens if we have one component and not the other? So this is another way that we can see how the strand depends on each other. Kind of like what Sarah said, if students are spending so much time trying to decode words because they are not fluent readers, they're missing out, like Sarah said, they don't have that brain space then to be able to actually comprehend what they're reading. And that's what we see often with our middle schoolers. They don't have the automaticity to decode. So then when it comes to comprehending what they're reading, they're not really thoroughly comprehending, especially when we're putting complex text in front of them. So when researchers look more closely, often what they find is that these students aren't really as fluent as we think, right? We hear our students read, but they're probably not as fluent as we think because they're working so hard on this word recognition, and it is impacting the comprehension that they are having when they read the text. So as Scarborough's rope illustrates, the research is clear about the connection between phonics instruction and comprehension. But before we jump into deeper, think about actually what's happening in our brain when we're learning to read, let's pause and really pull apart that word recognition or those skill-based competencies that we see in the green part of the rope. You'll see it in the top right corner too. So this strand is directly related to reading comprehension. So we're going to address some of the key terms that help us better make sense of brain science. So we're going to think about phonological awareness, phonics, decoding, how things become automatic, reading accurately and smoothly. So let's now get inside our heads to make more sense of this process. What actually goes on in the brain of students or the brain of anyone as we're learning to become fluent readers. So let's look at this process right here. Every word that we can read by sight, we would just automatically, it feels effortless, we can read it on a piece of paper, has three representations in our brains. So we have that visual or the orthographic representation. We have the speech or the phonological representation and the meaning or the semantic representation. So how do these three representations form in our brain? So first it starts with the oral language. Our brains are hardwired to acquire language. All it takes is just being immersed in language around us. So when we think about how important it is to read to kids as soon as they're born, right? And talk to them and engage them even before they can speak, because being immersed in a language-rich environment helps them to acquire language. When you're immersed in language, the speech and meaning areas of the brain are activated naturally. So when students hear a word, they are hardwired to determine the meaning of that word. The neural pathway naturally exists for them. So when we hear the word bat, we can automatically conjure up a visual in our head. We'll either see a bat, like the flying kind, right? Or a bat, like you use for baseball, depending on the context of what someone is saying or what you're reading. So what about when we see that word bat, like the visual representation? How do we get the sounds and the meaning? This connection to the visual and orthographic spelled out representation does not happen naturally like the others do. Our brains literally have to build the capacity to do this. So it is a learning process that impacts the formation of the parts of our brain. So forgive me ahead of time. There is a lot of things I'm going to go through on this slide, and you're going to stare at the same image for a while. But as you hear what I'm saying, I want you to be looking at the different parts of this image, about the different parts of the brain and how they are connecting to one another as we go through the process of this reading acquisition. So when it comes to reading, new technology has shown us, it turns out that our brains are much more similar than they are different. For example, here, what is inherent, there's a connection between speech and meaning in the brain. We hear a word and the meaning of the word is conjured. We have another part of the brain, this visual processor, which you see in orange. Just like the oral language to meaning connection, our brain is also hardwired to be able to recognize objects and to know what they are. So this is object recognition. When we see an object, the visual processing section of the brain at the back
Lindsay, I think we lost you. Maybe you got muted somehow.
Oh, what did you hear so far? How did I get muted?
It was just a few seconds.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to go back just to make sure. So letters on the page are also something that we see that activate our visual processor, but our brains are not hardwired to recognize that text and connect it with the meaning without being taught, kind of like what we saw in the previous slide with the bat. So in the beginning stages of teaching students to read, we essentially need to teach students to recognize the symbols on the page. So those letters, right? Spend a long time recognizing letters, both uppercase and lowercase, and associate them with sounds, right? A, B, B, right? Those are the phonemes. This builds a pathway between the visual representation to the phonological area. So early readers have no choice. They have to take that visual representation through the sound and speech areas to the meaning areas. So this is called the phonological route, and it becomes stronger and faster as students become more fluent. As students begin to strengthen their phonological pathways through that systematic phonological and phonics instruction we've been talking about, a new pathway is then formed between the visual and meaning areas of the brain. So that yellow and that orange part. This is the lexical route. As instruction continues and students get more practice with associating letters with sounds and blending them to make words, that phonological route is strengthening and new brain structures develop. So a specific area of our brain forms that is devoted solely to recognizing words rather than just objects. And as we get repetition with word sounds and multiple exposures to words, the meaning area of our brain, that yellow part, begins to more automatically recognize and assign meaning to those words. So this is the lexical route. So a direct route from our visual centers to our meaning centers, which increase the speed of decoding and fluency. It's a lot, a little bit more, guys, and then we could ask any follow-up questions and process what we're hearing. So these pathways, like we said, are not naturally occurring, and they develop in the same way, no matter the student. Students may just need different types of supports to develop them. So for the vast majority of children, that's 65% of students, they need to be developed through a direct instruction with lots of repetition. So a good analogy for all of this is like, let's think about sports, right? If you've ever played soccer, for example, you know that you don't just like get on the team and jump on the field the same day, right? Most teams spend hours together doing drills and practicing those foundational moves or skills that make up the game. So these drills, just like systematic phonics instruction, build muscle memory to make those, to make those moves automatic when you actually get out there on the field for the game. So just like that, explicit teaching of foundational skills is similar. Students need that time, that practice, that repetition, those drills over and over again to build their brain's visual word area. Any questions, thoughts about all that? Or anything that you're seeing here that bring a connection back to what you read for your pre-work? Just want to make sure we have some time and space to digest all of that information if we need to.
Is that the same once they get to middle school?
In terms, explain to me your question a little bit more.
Well, just thinking about like, I mean, I'm thinking about state law in Tennessee and brain development, myelination of the brain. When they get to, 8, we don't really give special ed, official special ed classification or labels until 8 due to that cognitive development stage because the window of approximation closes. And so I guess I was just wondering, because again, my son was diagnosed as being blind in his right eye in kindergarten, and we had literally the doctor told us 6 months to a year to change his vision or he would continue to be blind in that eye. So that's why we had to patch the good eye to strengthen the bad eye.
Yep.
So it makes me think about what you were saying, and I'm just curious, and you don't have to answer it now, but I am curious if when you think about a middle schooler's brain and where it is in comparison to a young child, if that, and I loved the names that you were giving, like the pathway, the phonological, phonological pathway. I was just wondering and trying to connect to a middle schooler and thinking about that too.
Yeah, that's a good question. And Reagan, you can layer in here too if you want. But so what I'm thinking here, right, is that we're expecting, so brain develops at a certain level, right, depending on what age we are, but also those pathways need to, what's the word I'm looking for? Intentionally be built, right? So if students are not getting that intentional instruction that is helping to build those pathways when they're in elementary school, they still may be missing some of these, the pathways may not be as strong once they get to middle school, which is why we need to think back to how we learn how to read so that we as middle school educators can think about how then to support these pathways to continue to develop to become fluent readers. Reagan, do you have anything else to layer in?
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think that it does. So when you see middle school students who aren't fluent readers, it's because when they're looking at words, they are going the long pathway, that circular pathway to get to meaning. And you see them, they're moving their lips when they're looking at the words. It's laborious. And I know we've all met those kids. And they probably have a bunch of words, more than the 6-year-old maybe, that are in that visual word form area and take sort of what I think of as like the like high-speed highway between visual and meaning. I think that the challenge is that often, I think there's two challenges. One is, I would venture to guess, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't promise you, that the brain is decreasingly malleable as you get older. I think school kids are still pretty malleable, but I would imagine that it's less malleable than a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. And so it may take longer. And I think the other challenge, which is real, is that there are fewer, as I think we probably have all experienced, there are just fewer resources that are really well designed for middle schools. It's a lot of things 6-year-olds actually are interested in, cats on mats and wearing hats and those kinds of things. And that is not particularly interesting to 12-year-olds, generally speaking.
Yeah, it just made it was interesting to me to have a son who essentially, they told me his visual processing, it like with that particular eye and how that eye processes things, by 7, by that zone of approximation, as they referred to it, would no longer be able to grow dendrites. And so it made me think, wow, as a reading teacher, I kind of geeked out with the eye doctor for like 15 minutes. I was like, oh my gosh, are you serious? But so it made me think about, we use the term here in Tennessee, you're probably familiar with it, like their mode of learning, like their, and I just forgot the term because I'm over 40 and need more caffeine, but it's a term that we say when they have like their visual or auditory processors, that they have this strength, that there's something that they've overdeveloped because something was underdeveloped, I guess. So anyway, I just geek out of that, but thank you.
No, thank you. So I want us to see this orthographic mapping in action. So that's like when we think back, that visual representation. So when we see the word bat, B-A-T on the page, that is the orthographic representation. So I want us to experience right now how powerful orthographic mapping, or that sight word recognition, actually is. So we'll start with these dots, okay? To yourself in your head, name the colors of the dots. Should be pretty fast and simple for all of us, right? Perfect. Now, remember your name. Now I want you to name the colors of the letters. So name the colors of the letters. Go ahead. So first, you're just looking at these, just in your head. What color are the dots? Here, you're going to name the color of the word. The color of the letters. I'm so sorry. The color of the letters. See, I'm even getting tripped up on this. So this, right, it's pretty automatic. Green, red, black, blah, 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 blah. Here, if you're naming the color of the letters, this is not as easy, right? You need to actually slow down and think about what you're doing. So even though I butchered that a little bit, by getting confused myself with all of the language. I'd love for you guys to share out how that felt different. This first, where we're just naming these colors, right? And here where we're naming the color of the letters, how that felt different. And I mean, I know I had to go slower the first few times I saw this. And did you have to? And like, why or how did you get tripped up? You could share it in the chat. You can take yourself off mute and share. Yeah, so when you saw the colors, you couldn't read the words. Exactly. That's what Lindsay shared.
I think your brain like is trying to do two things at once, and it gets confused as to which one it's supposed to be doing.
Right. Someone said I had to do them in pairs, matching colors. I had to pause for a second on each word. I actually went straight to reading them, right? You actually went straight to reading them than actually looking at the color of the letters, right? So when you saw this slide, you probably said to yourself, okay, blue, purple, right? But what you're actually supposed to say is green, red. Yep. Anything else in the chat or that you guys want to share out?
I've actually seen this before. And so what I had to do is I had to just focus in on one letter for each word. And so if you just focus in on one letter and you don't look at the word, it's a whole lot easier and faster. But I only knew that because I'd seen it before. So,
right.
You're not trying to look at the entire word.
Yeah, so this is a perfect example of like automatic reading, right? The point of this activity was we actually had to suppress our automatic reading to actually read or actually determine what color the letters were than actually reading the words. So this just shows once you become an automatic reader, you got it, right? It's pretty hard to suppress it. And for us, a lot of us had to catch ourselves. A lot of us had to remind ourselves what we should be doing. But our first instinct was to read what we saw, not identify what the color of the letter was. So that just shows you once our students have that automaticity, it really is there. But once you have it, you really have it. So that is just really, really a good way to show what this orthographic mapping actually looks like that happens in the brain for students. Science of reading drives effective, systematic instruction. It's very, very important to make sure we're having that effective, systematic instruction. So we talked about the process of learning to be a skilled reader, where those neural pathways have to be built. First, you need that deliberate practicing with discriminating between the sounds and then connecting sounds to the letters, right? And then building the ability to blend and segment sounds while connecting to print text or decoding and then making meaning. And the last level is efficiency in moving from that visual meaning to a meaning for more familiar words. And then rapidly through visual to sound to meaning for the non-familiar words. So here, Kilpatrick provides the simplified progression as levels. So these levels aren't completely isolated, right? You can have someone who masters, quote unquote, certain things before others, but typically this is what the progression looks like. So for example, so it shows how crucial it is for instruction to support students from the start to the end of the level, so that we're really getting to that automaticity with the word recognition side of that rope, right? We need to make sure that automaticity is there so that we open up brain space for that comprehension. So we talked about earlier, like, what does this actually mean? The science of reading, what does it have to do with us, right? As ELA middle school instructors. We talked a little bit about it before. I previewed it. Would love to hear from some other people or drop it in the chat. What else? Like, why is this so important for us as middle school educators? Bethany said, yes, there's definitely new appreciation for our pre-K to third grade teachers. 100%. As I think I shared with you guys before, my son is in kindergarten. He is doing some remote learning. We are going through all of this right now. And yes, that kindergarten teacher is a saint to make sure that she's meeting all of the kids where they need to be in a remote setting. So definitely new appreciation for them as well. So thinking back to us as middle school educators, why is this important for us? The science of reading. The gaps are even bigger. Yeah, definitely. We're seeing that middle schoolers still struggle with their fluency, and then they're not able to really access the complex text that we need to put in front of them. Definitely. Anything else?
Having some general knowledge helps explain why students can't all do the same thing.
Yep. You have an understanding now of what's happening in the brain and why maybe every student is not able to do the same thing.
I'll echo, I put it in the chat, reading's not so simple. It's not just something that all kids kind of get in the same way. And maybe it's an added level of empathy for our struggling middle schoolers. That it's not just that they don't want to, there's just a lot going on top of all the things they should be doing as that middle schooler, that they're, in terms of what they're missing.
Stresses the importance of accessibility. Just reading more may not be enough if they're missing some of what the mapping and pathways and sound spelling understanding. Exactly. New understanding for our students who are really struggling and have a deficit in reading, fluency, and comprehension. Yeah, all of this is spot on. There's so much that we can take away from the science of reading as middle school educators. I know that initially you're probably like, oh, I don't need to know how kids learn how to read, or maybe you guys not, but generally speaking, right? The public, the general public of educators who teach really like above 4th grade are like, oh, my kids know how to read. They were taught. Now we're going to dive into complex text. But there's so much more that could be going on when we see what we're seeing from so many of our middle schoolers in terms of their lack of fluency, which is totally inhibiting them to understand and grapple with complex text that we want them to be using and doing in middle school. So achievement gaps in literacy are rooted in students not having that foundation they need to make meaning from the text. So the foundation we're referring to here is that vocabulary, that knowledge, and that fluency. So like we've talked about, the ability to decode effectively or efficiently by forming that visual word area is directly related to the fluency, which we've seen to be a challenge with a bunch of our middle schoolers. Because middle schoolers don't have the fluency and are sometimes disfluent readers, they aren't able to grow their vocabulary or their knowledge, like we talked about, because they're spending so much time trying to decode those words rather than actually comprehending what's in front of them. So then they spend so much time, they're not comprehending, and they begin to continue to fall farther and farther behind. Here are some jarring statistics that I found that I wanted to share with you. So approximately 32 million adults in the United States can't read. And 50% of adults in the United States can't read a book written at an 8th grade level. And also, recent statistics show that 2/3 of students that are unable to read proficiently by the end of 4th grade will end up in jail or welfare. So those are some really jarring statistics about how big of a problem this is nationally. And if we think about that last statistic, we often get our students after 4th grade. And I'm sure a majority of our students, a lot of our students are coming without being proficient readers. And what does that mean for them? So it's just really important to think about this. So how do we combat this national issue? So that brings us to the literacy shifts and the Common Core or the Tennessee academic standards, right? So the literacy shift, which accompany those Tennessee academic standards, are designed specifically to combat this national issue. The shifts, which we'll talk about, are intended to ensure that literacy instruction across the board is focusing on what we know is most important parts of reading instruction. So when we think about the shifts, there are 3 we're referring to, which we'll dive deeper into today. There's building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. There's reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text, both literary and informational. And then there's regular practice with complex text and its academic language. So these are the 3 we're going to dive deeper into talking about today. So that first shift, that knowledge building shift, we want to build knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. So why is this shift so important? So when we're thinking about how knowledge impacts our ability to comprehend a text, it begs this other big question. How big of an impact does this knowledge really have on students being able to comprehend a text? So there were some researchers who actually wanted to find this out, and we're going to explore the results of this study now. The baseball study. A lot of you have seen this, touched a little bit on it in the pre-reading as well. So the researchers sought to answer this question by comparing the relative impact of reading ability to the impact of knowledge of a topic. So they had 7th and 8th grade students read a short text about baseball, and then they tested them for comprehension. And they used four things to test their comprehension. They did a verbal retelling, a reenactment with figurines, a verbal summary, and they rated ideas from the story in terms of importance. So they wanted to compare the impact of the general reading ability with the impact of the knowledge of the topic. In this case, it was baseball. So they grouped them into 4 groups. The first group was that high reading ability, high knowledge of baseball group. That's group A. Group B was high reading ability, but a low knowledge of baseball. Then there's group C, which is a low reading ability, but the high knowledge of baseball. And group D, who had the low reading ability and low knowledge of baseball. So I want you to just take a moment to review these groupings. And just so you know, that high reading ability is defined as 70th percentile or higher on standardized tests, and the low reading ability was defined as 30 percentile or lower. So these are our 4 groups, A, B, C, and D. I want you to take a minute to rank them and predict the results. Who scored the highest and who scored the lowest, and rank them. You can do that in your note catcher. You should have space to do that, or you could just think about it in your head, and then we'll reveal the results and talk about what that means. So these 4 groups, A, B, C, and D. The results, here they are. So our high reading ability and high knowledge students, which we probably assumed would perform the best. Then we had our low reading ability but high knowledge. Then our high reading ability and low knowledge, and then our low reading ability and low knowledge. Okay. So when you're thinking about these results, what do these results tell us, and what stands out to you most? We're going to drop a Padlet link in the chat, and we're going to answer these questions in our Padlet. So let me see if I could drop it in. Or John, maybe you could drop that in for us. Awesome, thank you. And so let's type in our thoughts about these questions. What did the results of this baseball study tell us, and what stands out most to you? Content knowledge is vital, no matter what the reading level. Content knowledge is very important. We normally know the polls with the bubble kids could be empowered in different ways. Content, so I'm having a hard time keeping up. It tells us that building knowledge in tier 1 instruction is the most equitable instructional practice we can provide. Love that. Most surprising was that A barely edged out C, even though the reading ability was so different. Totally agree. Content knowledge can mean more than reading ability. Background knowledge can be an equalizer. Reading ability and comprehension are not necessarily same. Students with broader knowledge base. Give us about 1 more minute to get our last thoughts done, and then we'll talk about these awesome reflections that you guys are having. Candace, I see your question. We'll talk about it in a second. All right, I'm going to put the slides back up. If you have anything else to write, feel free. If you want to keep this open so you could look at it and share your big takeaways. I mean, are we seeing, can you just give me a thumbs up if we're seeing the results again on the screen? Perfect. So what do these results tell us? I saw that like content knowledge is really important in terms of students being able to perform well on an assessment like this. Even those with a low reading ability but had that content knowledge were able to perform almost identically to those with the high reading ability and high knowledge. What else do these results really tell us, or what really stood out to you? I know that someone shared that they couldn't believe how close A and C were in terms of the results, even though the reading ability was so different.
Our responsibility to build knowledge to close gaps is just that. The more knowledge they can receive and build together, the more our gaps will close. I mean, I think in the past, I think traditionally I have experienced having knowledge withheld from me as both a student and having done so as a teacher myself, where I wanted to hold off on giving kids knowledge until they quote unquote got it. And what I'm reflecting on now is that more knowledge, even when they're not getting it, could potentially help them bridge the gap that they were showing the day before.
Totally. When I taught, so I taught, I think about my 4th graders, I taught in DC, and we had, this was like a while ago when we were using like passages from, we use a lot of passages from the Massachusetts state assessments to test prep long ago, before we knew what we know now. But I remember there was one passage that my kids read about the green monster, right? Fenway Park in Boston. And so many of my students, being from DC, knowing what their background was, had very little content knowledge around baseball at all. So they weren't even able to understand what they were referring to when they talked about the green monster, because they had 0% of that content knowledge. So yes, my high reading ability students were able to decipher some stuff, but for the majority of my students, they were really not able to comprehend anything they were reading because that concept of baseball was so foreign to them. So I see that Candace put a question in the chat. She said, how can we address building knowledge when considering fictional texts? So this is a really good question. I'm happy to answer it, but I would love to hear from all of you what you think about that in terms of building knowledge, and how do we think about building knowledge when we're putting fictional texts in front of students versus those informational texts. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm completely being vulnerable here. I don't know. First of all, let me just say, I don't know, but I wonder if when I'm trying to build knowledge of a text that is fictional, if I start to help children build knowledge of characters within that text through close reading more closely, to get to understand what the characters are thinking, feeling, and believing based off their actions, if we're having trouble with comprehension and making connections. And then through that character development, through close reading, can they personally connect through the characterization involved in that narrative as a way? I'm not saying it's the only way, and that sounds complex, so it might not work, but that's just what I'm wondering.
So I see build interest, I see building vocabulary, right? Through a fictional text, students can still build vocabulary about a topic that will be important for them to understand the content. I'm reading more of what's coming in the chat. Anything else that you guys are thinking?
I love Michelle's point here. And I think a lot of this, especially as you get into middle school and the texts are increasingly complex, so much of what you have to do is build content knowledge about the time period of a fictional text, the social context. And so, it would be hard to start reading, A Long Walk to Water as an example with 7th graders who have no concept of like what is happening in the Sudan. I mean, they'd have to have some background knowledge there. And so you can either supplement with articles or you're spending time with that knowledge building, and then they're going to continue to deepen their understanding of what is life like in war-torn, Africa, and kids taking this walk around Africa through the text.
Yeah, and I was going to say as well, I think, back in the olden days when I actually taught reading, a lot of what I would do, I'm embarrassed to say this, is I would present the background knowledge before I taught, before we read the story. And I just look back and think how horrible.
You should not be embarrassed. I'm sure a lot of people on this call did that because that's what we were taught to do.
It doesn't even have to be a text. It can be pictures. It can be lots of different pieces of information that give them visuals and just more information about what they're getting ready to read about.
Right. And instead of doing it that way, now we provide different types of text to allow them to deepen their understanding of the content, right? And we can do that through fictional text as well, through telling a fictional story about an experience that the fictional character had that is related to the topic that we're studying, that we learn more about through a nonfiction text, or even like something as, I'll bring it down like really low level, something as basic as like birds. If we're teaching elementary school kids about birds, we can have fictional text where we're talking about the different nonfiction text where we're talking about like, this is different type, these are different types of birds, this is the parts, the beak, and this is what it's used for. But then also you can have a fictional text about a bird who was out one day and used its beak to grab food and flapped its wings a certain way, and then met a penguin who couldn't use their wings the same way as them, right? So that is like a really low level example, but there's so much just like content you can build around a specific topic when you're using fictional and nonfiction text and informational text, which we'll talk more about there. So yeah, so when we think back to these results, I think you all hit spot on what the summary of these findings actually were, right? The researchers found that the knowledge of a topic really had a much bigger impact on comprehension than the generalized reading ability did. And with sufficient knowledge building about a topic, those low ability students performed really similar to those high ability students, right? So the second bullet right here has a big implication for student scaffolds, right? So by helping students build their content knowledge, those low readers can really perform at levels similar to those high readers. And someone brought this up, that difference between that A group and that C group was really not statistically significant at all, regardless of their reading ability. So I think this is a really, really good example that really shows how important building knowledge is for students. Now we're going to talk about that second shift, reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text. And when we're talking about text, we're talking about informational and literary text. So here is a passage. You also have this passage in your note catcher. So I want you to take a second to read this passage. And I want you to type the central idea of this passage into the text. What is the central idea of this passage? Type it into the chat. And we'll talk about it. Take a minute to read it. Type in what you think the central idea of this text is into the chat. So what is the central idea of this passage? Okay. See a lot of different ideas. Any other ideas you want to jot into the chat in terms of what the central idea of this paragraph is? Yeah, so I think that some of us have inferred what we think the central idea of this text is, but we really don't know for sure, right? It's difficult to determine the central idea of this paragraph. And some may even notice that what is the central idea, the author's purpose? That's like a DOK level 1 or 2 question, but it's still pretty hard to safely say that we can identify the central idea of this passage. So reading skills provide a short time boost, but are not always transferable across texts. So they depend on the background knowledge and vocabulary that a reader brings to the text. So you are all educators, grown-ups. If we put this in front of middle schoolers, do you think that they have the knowledge, the content knowledge, the background knowledge and vocabulary to come to a conclusion about what the central idea of this text is? Probably not. So research shows that while some gains can be made practicing these isolated skills, what's the author's purpose, use context clues to determine the main idea, what's the central idea, after a limited amount of practice, there are really no further gains. So ultimately, you can see that the complexity and content of the text must be paramount in instruction, right? It has to be paramount. The text selection has to become the driver. We need to make sure that we're choosing a text, and that is how students are able to build knowledge and be able to get to a place where they can truly understand the text. So let's think about ELA instruction as we once knew it to what we know now, right? So back in the day, quote unquote, we really taught skills in isolation, right? Today, we're going to learn how to identify the main idea. Today, we're going to learn what context clues are and use context clues to identify the main idea. What is the author's purpose, right? We focus on teaching skills in isolation. We focus on teaching those strategies in isolation. There was that little emphasis on text complexity. Primary focus was on simple recall or superficial analysis, often with decontextualized text, and there was little or no emphasis on actually using textual evidence. Now, we focus on the text and use the standards to support students to deeply understand the text. The text, like I said, is paramount, and that is what we need to be focusing on. Text selection as driver versus isolated skill practice. Yes, thank you, Bethany. And Candace agrees. This is what we really need to be thinking about. It is so important to think about the text we're putting in front of kids. We need to make sure that the text is at the center. Students are grounding what they're doing, whether they're reading, writing, or speaking, in evidence from the text. And we're not teaching skills or strategies in isolation anymore. That is really, really important to remember, because those skills, those strategies aren't necessarily transferable across text depending on how much knowledge you have on what you are reading about. Very important to remember. Then we think about the third shift, complexity. Regular practice with complex text and its academic language. So what does this actually mean? And why are complex texts worthy of time and attention? I want you to look right here. In the blue, you'll see the average lexile demands of a 12th grade text, and then the average lexile demands of a text that a college freshman might have, right? That's a huge gap. So to address this gap between what students are reading in high school and what they're reading in college, it can't just be about text selection, right? The standards demand that we look at instruction differently as well. And that was what that first shift was. So we can't just put harder text in front of students and expect them to be able to read them. That's just not going to happen. We have to be thoughtful and strategic about the scaffolds and supports we use. So here you'll see the 2006 ACT study. This study was instrumental in the research behind the standards. It's actually cited in Appendix A. They looked at student performance on the ACT as related to question types. They found that students who performed well with literal questions, those just their questions, performed equally well with those inferential questions. So a kid who's scoring a 16 is getting about 40% of the literal questions right, and also about 40% of those inferential questions right. So if we were to follow that conventional wisdom from the field that we've all heard about, we would expect those literal, those right there questions to be easier for students, right? Especially our struggling readers. What we might expect this student to get maybe 50% of literal questions right and maybe only 30% of those inferential questions, but that's not what's happening. Kids at all score levels answer literal and inferential questions correctly at just about the exact same rate. Just pretty crazy to think about. So similarly, question types by textual element, so such as main idea, author's purpose, did not differentiate students' performance. So similarly, a student who's scoring a 16 is getting about 40% of the questions on main idea, supporting details, word meanings, generalizations, and conclusions. Which begs us to think, why are the individual standards or skills the driver for literacy instruction? If the student performs poorly on the main idea question, he or she is very likely to perform poorly on the details and conclusion question. So what is tripping up these students? The complexity of the text. That is what is tripping them up. Until these college and career ready benchmark, which is the score of 21, kids were basically guessing. They're flatlining on complex texts. As students' ability to comprehend the complex text improves, they are getting more answers correct. So what does this mean? This means that we can't just put, like I said, increasingly complex text in front of students. We also need to think about moving our instruction that focuses on the question types or the individual standards that we are focusing on within those complex texts. And that is what, when we think about those other two shifts, those are really about. We need to put complex text in front of students. We need to think about the questions we're asking them and ensure that they're the right questions. So let's talk a little bit about text complexity. I'm not going to dive too deep in this today because we're going to spend some time in our January session talking a little bit more about text complexity, but we'll do a quick overview today. Some of you may have seen this, this may be new to some of you. So in order to truly understand what stumbling blocks could be for students, we need to think about what makes the text that we're putting in front of them complex. This is an important thing we need to make sure we're doing every time we're choosing a text, starting a text with students. So there's three elements of complexity. There's that quantitative scale, that's like their lexile level, what a computer can see and measure, the number that comes with it. There are those qualitative measures, those text features that are judged by human evaluation. So the structure of the text, the language and knowledge demands, the purpose. And then there's, just the professional judgment, consider the appropriateness of the text for the students and the task. So remember, it is really important to think about what strategies we as teachers or as educators can use to help students access complex texts. And one of those strategies that we often talk about is close reading, right? That is a strategy that we can use to support students in accessing these complex texts. But in order to be able to ensure we're helping them access the complex text, we ourselves need to understand how the texts are complex and where they're most complex, and how we need to leverage that close reading or the questions we're asking or how we're approaching the text really effectively to ensure that students can really grapple with it and understand what they're reading. So we think about these three measures. I remember, when I was teaching, we would just look at the lexile level and say, okay, this lexile level is appropriate for my fourth grader, okay? But then when we think about those lexile levels or those quantitative measures, those alone are insufficient. So look at these two books here. Grapes of Wrath and Ramona Quimby age 8. They're both a 680 lexile level. That's pretty surprising, right? You're not going to likely give a third grader Grapes of Wrath, right? So when we think about Steinbach's use of simple language and dialogue as a stylistic choice, it makes sense that the text is pretty readable. But I think we can all agree that most of our 3rd through 5th graders, which 680 really focuses on, is not yet prepared to read this text. So this just shows that the quantitative measure alone is not sufficient. You need to think about all the other pieces of the text to ensure that it's appropriate for your students and to ensure that you are putting structures in place to help them unwrap the meaning and grapple with that complex text. So you guys have, I'm sorry it's so small, but you guys also have copies of these in your notes. So these are the text complexity rubrics. So in addition to looking at that quantitative measure, we need to look at the quality of the text as well, and think about how we then support students in accessing the text. So qualitative analysis of a text is so important to consider. You want to determine the different complexity levels throughout the text, right? And scaffold the questions, plan out the activities accordingly. One part of the text could be one level of complexity, but then the language or the context can change dramatically later in the text, and you need to scaffold it differently. So you really need to read the text before you're teaching it, obviously, but then also really identify and think about the complexity throughout the entire text. And then subsequently think about what questions you're asking and plan out those accordingly to make sure that students are really able to grapple with that. You're lucky that your curriculum often has questions really scripted out for you to help get at the complexity, but you also need to think about your students, what other questions you might need to ask potentially in certain parts of a text to really ensure that students grapple with that text that's in front of them. Any questions about text complexity before we start to think about what this actually looks like in practice?
Lindsay, I don't know exactly what I'm saying again, but I do think it would be a good point to pause for people to kind of think about what tools they're using to identify students as grade level and think about the year. I know this sounds like a crazy question, but if their materials that they're using to assess students' quote unquote levels are not above 2012, it's likely that it does not match the stretch complexity bands that we adjusted within the Common Core. And again, I say that because, for example, the DRA, those kits that districts purchase, they're expensive, right? And like they're very expensive. And so to have enough to be in a school, if you purchased them in 2006, it would be a lot to think about purchasing all new kits in 2012. But if you're still using those kits, in some cases, you are falsely identifying students as on grade level. And yet in the new complexity band, those kids very well could be as much as 1.5 to 2 years below grade level in their district. And I do think that that's just something to mention here. I know it's not part of the Tier 1 instruction necessarily, but in terms of, you know, we do spend a lot of time labeling students on grade level or grade level text. I do think if a school was to look at that, that would be an interesting conversation piece to have with teachers, because inadvertently, I think that those kinds of materials shape the school's understanding of what proficiency means. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you.
I think it's a good point, and I will say, I don't think that as a field, assessment has quite caught up anywhere, honestly, with what we now know and want for kids in terms of literacy experience. And so we still see, even if you were to buy new versions of assessments, you still see a lot of like, let's break the kids down by who's struggling with cause and effect and who's struggling with main idea. And we've just seen that that's clearly not how it actually plays out. And so I don't think as a field, the assessment folks have quite caught up, at least with the same quality as we've seen in curricular materials catch up. I think what it does point to, though, is the importance of assessment within your curricular materials, which really should be an assessment of what kids are able to do in relation to the content that you all have been doing.
Well, and not to invalidate the assessment process itself. I mean, it does have value,
No,
right?
exactly. It is
Yeah,
really
yeah.
powerful, but it's not, they haven't quite caught up to where we are. And so, we often talk about the increasing importance of the assessments built into materials because they generally are more in alignment with the approach and the research.
Well, I think it's more of a cultural, it does have this inadvertent drive. It drives the culture of what we believe is grade level. And that's the danger of that, though, is that what we're even hearing now. And I mean, I hear it all. I kind of am in this world a lot more frequently recently, and it still feels wrong in some sense when you think about what it is you're using diagnostically with students. And so I think that just taking a moment to think about what tools you're using, when was the last time you purchased new materials to support those lexile levels and that understanding, and what kind of conversations can you have around, this is the target is here. We were using materials that was hitting the target that would put us back here. And so because of that, we also have a misunderstanding of complexity because of what we believe has been the driver of proficiency, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for that thoughtful analysis, so to speak, Sarah. I appreciate that. Any other thoughts, guys, in response to what Sarah said, in response to what we talked about in terms of the 3 shifts, in terms of the text complexity rubric, or the different types of, ensuring that we're thinking about all the different parts of complexity when we're determining the text we're putting in front of students? Any thoughts or comments? I have the chat open too, in case that's easier for you. Just want to make sure we have the opportunity.
Well, and I'm throwing this out here again. It makes me think of like the Lexile analyzer that's on like lexileleveler.com. And if I would wonder if your district's understanding of proficiency makes some of this ability to diagnose the complexity of text you're looking at, which could actually happen. I have been a part of conversations in my own district where that's occurred. It's sometimes better to have a third party identifier and then to dig into why that is, because it's hard to qualify or quantify how much that can absolutely skew people's ability to embrace complexity. And that ingrained cultural usage of a DRA tool, for example.
Well, this doesn't directly relate to what you're saying, but in our next session, we'll have an opportunity to actually look at how our curriculum identifies the complexity of a text, and then think about what that actually means for our teaching, which I think will be a really good exercise and just a way for us to think more deeply about complexity. I'm just reading yes. So Candace says, thinking about using the complexity rubric to determine how to scaffold the complex text. And I think that is exactly right. And we'll be talking more about that and thinking about, based on the complexity of the text we're putting in front of students, how do we need to scaffold questions throughout the text? How do we need to scaffold activities to allow them to really unlock that meaning and grapple and understand what we're putting in front of them? Because potentially like simple questions that we're asking throughout are not going to get them there, right? What text dependent questions are we creating? Do we need to spend more time in certain parts of the text over others, depending on what type of complexity we're seeing? So all of that is really important and things we need to be thinking about. And like I said, as a preview to January, we'll be spending some time talking about that and thinking about what that looks like, and actually diving into our curricular materials and seeing kind of how that comes to play or lives out in our materials. So what I want to do now is I want to bring us back to the opportunity myth that we talked about last week. So when we focus on the opportunity myth, we talked about those 4 resources that we know are really important for students to have. We need them to have those grade appropriate assignments, strong instruction, deep engagement, and teachers with high expectations. So what I want us to do now is I want us to describe a classroom in which all of the shifts are working all of the time. So what would a classroom look like where students are grappling with complex text, where students are building content knowledge, where students are reading and writing grounded in evidence. What would it look like? What would the student's experience look like? And what would it look like if all these 4 resources actually lived out, look like in a room that lived out the shifts? So I'd love to spend a few minutes in a Padlet this time again, thinking about what would the student experience look like if the shifts were in play in a classroom, and what would the 4 resources look like in a room where the shifts were really in play consistently. So we're going to drop the Padlet link recording. I apologize, I resumed it. Sorry, guys. It was only for 10 seconds. Yes. So John dropped it in the chat. So let's go into the Padlet and think about those questions, and we'll come back together and talk it out. Students would be doing the heavy lifting, not the teacher. Students be working with consistently working with high quality complex texts. Students reading complex text and answering appropriate level questions. Student-led learning. Student-driven versus teacher-driven. Students actively engaged, knowledge building, leveling the playing fields, in-depth discussions, love it. Group discussion, love that. Discussions about the text, revisiting the text often to support their writing. Teacher taking on a facilitator role while the students are leading the learning, love it. Engagement, student discussion, facilitation by the teacher, students doing the doing. I think you guys are spot on in terms of what we would see in a classroom where the shifts are really coming into play and ensuring those 4 resources are there. So can you guys spend about a minute just thinking about that other question? What would the student experience look like? You talked a little bit about the students leading the learning. Any other ideas around that student experience? Students would feel empowered. Yes. They would feel challenged. They would experience confidence. Give us about 30 more seconds to get our ideas out. Some really great ideas happening. Academic conversations happening between students. Students would develop stamina and persistence. Perfect. So I'm going to bring us back. So I think that everything that you guys said was spot on in terms of what the student experience would look like and what a classroom would really look like in which the shifts were really working all the time. Any comments that you guys want to share that you didn't capture in the Padlet about these questions and thinking about how it relates back to those 4 resources we talked about last week when we dove into the opportunity myth? Any thoughts or ideas that came to life?
I mean, indirectly, I feel like I'm kind of looking at all of the posts as a whole, and it does seem like that we're describing an energy shift for teachers, right? Like they are moving from the director, the driver, the motivator to the text and the questions of the students being the driver of the learning to go deeper. But I feel like that's a huge energy shift.
It is. It's, none of this is gonna, happen overnight. That's why we're thinking about what it could look like, what it should look like, and how we get there, right? And for students too. Megan said, not just teachers, students too, right? In order for students to feel that deep engagement and be deeply engaged, they then become the leader of their learning, right? They feel empowered. They really, it is a shift to them just sitting there as passive receivers of information, right? We want them to become active learners, and that is a shift for some teachers and also for some students. Yeah, we talked about Lou specifically. She was bored. She was bored in her class. The teacher wasn't ensuring that there was deep engagement for her students. Perfect. The sage on the stage, yep, it needs to stop and allow students to be heard, seen, and demonstrate their knowledge. Yep, and if students lead, they gain their ability to teach and not just learn quietly. All of this is so important. And as we progress in our learning together, we're going to come back to the opportunity myth and thinking about these 4 resources and thinking about what we need to make sure is true in our schools, in our classrooms, in our district, to ensure that we are providing students with what they are expecting that they're going to get from us as their educators. So I wanted to bring it back to that. But know that this will not be the last time we will talk about, see, or hear about the opportunity myth. So just keep those 4 resources in the back of your mind as we continue to dive deeper into the content over the next weeks and months. So what I want us to do now is we had time to talk about all those 3 shifts. And now we're going to spend some time digging into the instructional practice guide, also known as the IPG. Some of you may have seen this before. This may be brand new to some of you. So the instructional practice guide has been adopted and used across the state of Tennessee. And the IPG outlines what instructional practices we should be seeing in a classroom with exemplar literacy instruction. I know you see this and you're like, oh, another tool, another this. This is not an evaluation tool at all. Rather, this IPG has indicators that give guidance to teachers, to leaders about high leverage practices that we want to be using to lift up that student, lift up the practice and see student improvement. So these are practices that we have seen and known to help students improve and that we've known and seen to be best practices in literacy instruction.
Hey, Lindsay, can I add something
Yes,
real quick?
Of course.
We also wanted to make sure as we were kind of designing how we might move forward as a network, that we thought about what district and school leaders were involved in with the Tennessee Department of Ed. We know that you all are engaged if you're doing the sessions on implementing high quality materials, that you all are also talking about this instructional practice guide. So we thought, hey, let's work smarter, not harder. We didn't want to overwhelm you with something else to think about. And no tool is perfect, but in this case, at least that would allow some seamless work that would at least happen at that district and school leader level, and then allow that these indicators as we surface these over the next few months together and the time of the network, that we could get this down to the teacher level and really, like Lindsay said, really lift up some of these high leverage practices that we know or feel pretty strongly lead to improve student outcomes at the classroom level.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that connection there, Bethany. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to give you guys should have a copy of this in your notes. So spend about 2 minutes reviewing the IPG, and then we're going to be put in that 2 minutes. John will put us in breakout rooms with our school groups or our district teams. And I want you to think about where you see the shifts present in the IPG. So look at all of the core actions and the indicators, and then identify where you see these 3 shifts come to life in the IPG. You can annotate, you could write, whatever works for you. So think about, these are our 3 shifts: building knowledge, reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence, regular practice with complex text. Where do we see those 3 shifts live out in the IPG, talk about it, and then we'll come back together and share our findings at 10 after 5. All right, so it looks like everyone is back. So I was able to pop into almost every breakout room, but I'd love to hear what you guys discussed, where you saw the shifts we talked about live or come to life in the IPG, and just some reflections you had generally. I heard some really great discussions, so I'd love to hear big takeaways and what you guys focused or talked about or noticed.
So we were talking about co-action 1, and that those are basically the 3 shifts, with A being 2 with reading and writing with evidence from the text, B being 3 with the regular practice with it saying for the grade and time of the school year and it being continuous, and C being the first one with building knowledge because it says provide meaningful information in the service of building knowledge.
Other thoughts or ideas?
We talked a little bit about the culture of learning, which is kind of a backbone for when you're making these shifts with your kids. You've got to show them the excitement of learning, the joy of learning, and your joy and your teaching and the excitement to show them that these shifts are possible. Yes, when we start making these shifts, our kids are going to be like, what are we doing? This is really hard. But I've noticed that the more, the happier you are, the more excited you are about something. Also, doesn't just say it's going to be fun to learn. It also exudes that confidence that, I believe you can go deeper, you can do these things. And I think that's important to facilitate the shifts just as much as having the shifts.
We also talked a little bit about, the core action 2, we talked quite a bit about, but then we also talked about how when you are in that facilitator role, the implied shift here that's not necessarily listed is that shift of teacher controlling the classroom to teacher as facilitator as well.
Yeah, let's look a little bit closer at core action 2, not too close as we're going to spend a lot of time looking at it in a few weeks, but I really you could really pull out a bunch of the shifts just in core action 2 alone. Love to hear where you see evidence. Yeah, we talked about in core action 1, we see evidence. Where in core action 2 do you see evidence of those shifts explicitly?
So in core action 2, because you're being pushed back into the text throughout core action 2, it really hits all of those things because, you're going to be building background knowledge because you're being pushed back into the text, you're pushed into that nonfiction text. The questioning that takes place with your text, that's going to be key to what students write and speak about. When you take a look at core action 2 and letter C, it talks about your academic vocabulary. So that's your academic language. Core action 2 really also hits all of those shifts when you talk about that particular one.
Yeah, so I think based on what you're noticing, I think the big takeaway is that we can see the shifts live out in all over this IPG, right? So they really go hand in hand, and over the next few months together, especially in January, we're going to dig into the IPG a little bit more, focusing on some core actions, some indicators, and thinking about what that actually looks like when it plays out in the classroom or in our schools and our districts. So I think the big takeaway here is there is a really strong connection between the shifts and the IPG, and we can see evidence of the shifts throughout this entire document. Much of what you already noticed in your discussion with your group. So keep this IPG handy. You will need it. Mine lives right here next to my desk. But we will be diving deeper into it, thinking about it, focusing on it as we progress in our learning together over the next few months. To kind of close out our time together, I want to put everything we talked about together today. I want us to think about the IPG. I want us to think about the shifts. So we're going to go back in our groups with our school or district. And I want you to think about and discuss the following with your team. Where do you see evidence of the shifts in your schools? Looking at these indicators on the IPG, which indicators are really evident, or are you doing really well implementing? And which indicators are you really like need to be implemented more, or need to be implemented, period, or not really present? It's not a gotcha moment. It doesn't really matter. This is just us being reflective so we can think about where we go from here. So it is now 5:16. John is going to put us in our groups and we're going to come back together in 10 minutes at 5:26, and then we will close out with some next steps. So stay tuned to get in your group and think about these questions as we talk together. Oh, one thing I forgot to share with you. What we're going to do so that we can capture the learning is we're going to enter our information into a Google Doc. So John has dropped the link to the Google Doc in the chat. Fingers crossed everyone can access it. You will see your team name, and then you can choose one person to type in, or you can all type in so that we can see kind of everyone's reflection. So we will see you back together in 10 minutes, and I will pull open the Google Doc so everyone can kind of see progress and thoughts as we progress together. So see you all soon, and yeah, join your breakout rooms, and we are good to go.
Oh, we weren't ready. We were having a good discussion.
I know. We could have stayed in these groups for like 30 minutes easily. I'm going to give everyone, I have everything up here. So I'm going to give you guys about like 30 seconds just to review what trends you're seeing, and or anything you want to share. And we'll do that for about 2 minutes and then we'll close out. Yeah, John linked that. So if you guys want to open it yourself, that's probably easier so that you can scroll up and down yourselves. Thanks for that, John. So just in the interest of time, what are some big takeaways you're seeing, or some trends you're seeing in this document, or things that you guys talked about in your own group? And remember, this is not the last time we'll be talking about the shifts in the IPG. So this will be a to be continued conversation, but love to just wrap up with some reflections of where you guys currently are given the shifts in the IPG. One thing I noticed is that a lot of people talked about, because of the curriculum that they're implementing, there are more complex texts being put in front of students. Students are doing more writing. I saw a lot of that. Anything else that really has changed because of your curricular implementation, or things that you're noticing you guys are doing well or doing pretty consistently?
Lindsay?
Yes. Oh, sorry.
My group noticed something else about their curriculum. It actually was a weaker spot that they had mentioned before. What they used before was better at one particular thing. But overall, I feel like this reflection tool was great because they got to see all the good that they are doing already. And they started with the IPG, they said 3 or 4 years ago. And it helps identify, it just helps hone down where their curriculum may or may not be lacking and where it's strong. So I just felt like it was a good ID type kind of tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think we do enough of like stepping back and thinking about, we actually are doing a lot of things really well. And it's hard to notice that in the world of COVID and the stresses that we are feeling as educators, and also when implementing new curriculum. So I agree. I think there was some good reflection happening. And like I said, we are going to continue to talk more about what we are doing well, what we're seeing happening in our schools and our districts in light of the standards in the IPG, and where we still want to continue to improve and implement differently. So like I said, we will continue this conversation about the IPG in January. Thank you all so much. I'm going to have Bethany wrap us up. I will not see most of you before the holiday. Have a wonderful, restful break. You all deserve it. And I will see you in 2021, which will hopefully be better than 2020.
All right, Lindsay, our next step slide, real quickly, some action items. A reminder to return your network member MOU to Brittany. Those went out, and so as soon as you can get that completed, send that back to her. Also, watch for an email from me, Bethany, with a network member photo request. I know, cringe. But here's the deal. I just want you to pick a favorite photo of yourself, and what we would like to do is build further out that member section on our website, and we'll kind of group photos by team, and just like I said, it's all part of just getting to know each other as we move forward as a learning community. But watch for an email from me about that. Also, upcoming network dates. Lindsay mentioned session 3 of our launch in 2021. That'll be on January 14th. And then these are our tentative, pretty solid spring dates. Tried to pull up everybody's district calendars and try to avoid spring break. But again, more information will come about exactly what we'll be doing on these dates. But they are already on our shared calendar on the website as just a hold. But like I said, more information will come regarding that. And just like that, it's 5:30. My belly's growling. I'm ready for supper. All right, we are just so thankful for everybody. You just engaged in such a wonderful way today with each other. And so we will wish you a happy holidays, to echo Lindsay's thoughts. We'll hang around if anybody has any additional questions. But other than that, we'll see you next year, right? Wah, wah.
Bye, everybody.
Happy holidays. Merry Christmas.